Thank you very much. And thank you for joining me today as we talk about Finding Sherlock, a story that we wrote for a poster that SANS has just released. You can get all your posters from SANS at sans.org/posters. Well, there we go. So just real quick about me, I work at GitHub. I'm a cloud security architect. I also spend a lot of time troubleshooting cloud problems. I'm also the co-author for Security 541, which is our cloud threat detection class. And we also now have a new cert that goes along with that class. I spent 20 years at the National Security Agency before this, and I was also the technical director for Blue, Red, and Hunt. And so that fed a lot into the way we wrote our class because it's really designed to take a look at, hey, here's an attacker, and then what their attackers are doing, and how might you go detect what that attacker is doing. So about our poster, we have two sides of our poster. We have the posters in the back. Now I'm trying to get my hands right. So we have one side of the poster, which is a story, a six-part story of an attack against a fictitious, obviously, Sherlock Holmes environment. This is like modern day BBC Sherlock Holmes, obviously, otherwise it'd be really weird. We take a look at the attacks that are happening in this fictitious story. We map them to the MITRE attack techniques. We made it so it would work in either AWS or Azure, trying not to be a specific cloud environment. It is a story, so we wanted to cut a story flow. On the detect side, which is right over here, we take a look at and kind of group the different kinds of resources you might find in a cloud environment, such as like compute and storage and networking, and those kind of groups. And then we identify the specific AWS and Azure log types, what the logs are good for, maybe some commentary on whether this works really great for initial detection versus might work really good for an investigation, which both of those logs are very necessary, but they do have different focuses and usually different fidelity of data. This poster and the story that we're going to talk about today is reflective of the 541 class. I guess I should say up front is that in the class, we talk about real stories against real attacks against real companies. Of course, this one today is a fictitious one. I want to say a special thanks to David Garrison, who does the graphics for these SANS posters and for this one. Everything that you're seeing on these slides is graphics part of the poster. I did not do because he is phenomenal. So I highlight that. So I think that's enough intro. Let's get really into the story. So our story starts with Moriarty looking for Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has gone into hiding. Moriarty is the evil mastermind of most of the problems that Sherlock Holmes faces. And Moriarty is looking for Sherlock Holmes. He figures that the one person who would know where Sherlock Holmes is Sherlock Holmes's brother, Mycroft, who works for the British government in some kind of unknown office, but he definitely seems to have a lot of capabilities and knowledge behind him. And so Moriarty figures that the best way to find Sherlock Holmes is probably to hack into Mycroft's network or infrastructure, or something that he might have. He might have a clue as to what's going on. So what we see is we have a potential network that we want to try and hack into, or Moriarty wants to hack into. And so Moriarty is going to go and find some of the best and brightest hackers and evildoers to try and hack into some personal infrastructure that Mycroft is running in a cloud environment and try and find a clue as to where Sherlock Holmes is. So the first person that Moriarty brings on is Culverton Smith. This is Culverton is a serial killer, but also he has lots of ties into the underground. And so we're going to have Culverton's going to go and try and figure out where an infrastructure might be that Moriarty can hack into, or Moriarty's team can hack into. So Culverton's going to do some OSINT, some open source intelligence, going to try and evaluate what kind of web presence that Mycroft has. So this is if we were talking about advanced persistent threat, this is certainly a persistent threat. We're not just doing an attack based off of, hey, I want to get some ransom out there. I'm going after a particular target, and I'm going to use different kinds of means to go after that particular target. And so Culverton's doing an evaluation of Mycroft and his infrastructure, and he finds that Mycroft has used a web address, a Gmail address out there that try to hide who he is. He's paid an informant who's told him that this is Mycroft's actual email address. And he does some investigation of that email address, and he finds that Mycroft has actually set up a web page that doesn't say it's Mycroft, but we know it's Mycroft from the email address. And this web page is set up to track and research old books, which is a hobby of Mycroft, so it makes sense that it would be his. So Culverton has gathered some initial information through OSINT and starts investigating, and he finds that there is this web page, and the web page has changed, so there's content that's being changed on it, which means there's probably code somewhere. So he starts doing some investigation. He finds a Git repo. Let's say it's GitHub. Investigates that GitHub repo, evaluates it, doesn't see any kind of initial access vector into a cloud environment, even though he knows that there's got to be someone somewhere. Keeps digging. And so he decides, hey, instead of looking at the files that are in GitHub, I'm going to open up the previous commits. I'm going to look at the history of this this bibliography or bibliophile web page and investigate and see if there's anything I can find. And lo and behold, in the middle of one of these commit strings, there's a piece of code. Let's say it was a some kind of accidentally checked in code, a file that had initial credentials into a cloud environment. He takes those initial credentials, tests it out, is able to figure out which account it is based off of the credentials, and then is able to get into a cloud environment. That's all he was paid to do. He takes that, he turns it over to Moriarty. Now, the MITRE ATT&CK tactic that they was going after is initial access. Long-term credentials that are being accidentally checked in, or let's say brute forcing a username password is one of the main ways in which an attacker gains initial access into a cloud environment. I always look at 3 different ways they might do it, either guessing or finding credentials, which is what we see here from Culverton. The second way is actually hitting infrastructure that was not protected at all. That happens quite often. Surprisingly, you will see S3 buckets used to be the big story. For an S3 bucket, now you actually have to hit, yes, I want this to be public, like 3 times. So I don't think that it's accidental anymore. If you see it, I think it's on purpose. But websites that might actually have not been configured properly, Kubernetes clusters that have been put out without any username and password happens. And you can go and scan right now and find them out there. So that's the second way. The third way that I typically break down initial access vectors into the cloud is hacking an application. What we're looking at here is, number one, that there was some credentials that were checked into a GitHub repo. It happens that if some people will check in their credentials, let's say for an AWS environment, and then they say, oh, I made a mistake, and they go and change the commit, you actually have to go and delete the commit out of the GitHub repo for it to disappear. Otherwise, it's going to actually be safe, because GitHub and these other Git repos, they store the history. And so if at some point you've accidentally checked in something, you actually have to remove it and delete it. And so that's what Culverton was able to do, was able to find these credentials in there. Now, how do we detect that's happening? Whatever your initial access vector, identifying someone logging in, that's the job of the credentials. It's really kind of hard to detect someone logging in and knowing that, oh, they weren't supposed to. There are things that you can do where you can say, they're coming from a different part of the world than I'm used to. Single sign-on services that you might be using, like Okta, has those kind of capabilities. However, most of us work in a remote or partially remote environment. And so you're going to be logging in from all over the place. So it's harder than it used to be to have that geography-based fencing put up. A lot of times what you would do is you would see an attack later down the line, and then you want to kind of back up to try and figure out where that initial attack vector is. Your single sign-on logs, maybe your cloud activity logs, if you're using something like Azure AD logs would be another one. That's your single sign-on. They're going to show when people log in and what temporary credential they were given when they log in. So detecting initial vector would be hard. Certainly detecting it when you're doing an investigation, you can see that kind of stuff. How would you stop this kind of thing from happening? Long-term credentials is trouble. We don't want them. They're all over the place and they're used a lot with API accesses and like third-party systems coming in, but we want to try and get rid of them at every chance we can. If we can't, turn on multi-factor authentication for humans that are logging in, rotate your keys every 90 days. If these keys had been rotated, then Culverton may not have been able to get access because they would have been, let's say they're more than 90 days old. In all these screens, I actually have the MITRE ATT&CK technique down in the bottom. Although I believe I have too many letters for the first one. So I think it's 1213. I just noticed a typo, but I have the MITRE ATT&CK technique down there at the bottom so you can see them. Moriarty took those credentials and said, okay, we've got some initial credentials. We have initial access. Let's give it to Henry Peter, a con artist, to try and figure out what we can do with that. So Henry's going to go in and investigate and figure out what infrastructure is actually in place. They're going to do the discovery attack. You start scanning the cloud environment. Now, the amazing thing about the cloud environments is they're actually designed to easily tell you what's been deployed. Back in our on-prem days, I might do a port scan and it'd be noisy and, hopefully it works. But now in the cloud environment, if you have credentials, you can just ask the question, what are my storage accounts? What are my virtual machines? If you've been given permissions, you'll be able to see that information. Now, Henry was able to scan in. Henry was not allowed to see storage counts or S3 buckets, was not allowed to see a lot of things, actually very locked down credential. The only thing that Henry could interact with was a CICD pipeline, some kind of virtual machine that had been stood up in the cloud environment, whose job it was to publish the infrastructure and the application for this web page, this bibliophile web page. But that's about all he was able to do. So he did that initial discovery, couldn't really get further on, did not see a lot of information, turned this report over back to Moriarty so that Moriarty could take it from there. Now, an attacker is going to gain access to this environment. The first thing they're going to do is the discovery, the cloud environment made for discovery if you have an over-permissioned credentials, which typically, if you're logging in as a human, you have the ability to see most things in the environment. Maybe you're locked out from changing them, but you might be able to log in and see things. The credentials that are coming through APIs, it depends on what the API is for or what those credentials are being used for. And CICD Pipeline, which we see that here, the CICD Pipeline probably can do a lot. So that may be the next thing that Moriarty goes after. All right, if I'm going to try and detect that someone is doing a discovery and enumerating my resources, in AWS, I have CloudTrail. CloudTrail will tell you what's going on. It's very noisy. There's lots of things doing what looks like a discovery attack. If you log into your cloud environment and you go to a page that lists like your S3 buckets, it's going to be a list of S3 buckets and print it back. But if you're doing an investigation, somebody's attacked you, I really want to know what the attacker knows, because I want to be able to see where they possibly have gone next. In Azure, I don't have the ability to look at a discovery attack. The Azure activity logs do not tell me get operations or list operations or describe operations. They only tell me changes, updates, creates, news, deletes, those kind of things. So I don't have that information in my Azure environment. Best way to mitigate from a discovery attack is least privilege everything. I mean, I think probably every one of these slides for a mitigation, we could put least privilege. I want to ensure that the person who has access to the environment, they can only get to what they're supposed to. So if my job is to manage, let's see, storage accounts, I shouldn't be able to see virtual machines. An API that's being, or let's say a third-party application that's interacting with your cloud environment, they usually have something very specific they're allowed to do. And so you want to make sure that your identity access management is tailored just for that. And that appears to be the case with the credentials that have been provided. Well, now that we know that there's a CICD service and there possibly could be storage data and other things, but we can't see it with our current credentials, we're going to have to bring out the big guns. So Moriarty is going to have to go and hire the smartest hacker there is in order to try and figure out how to escalate into the environment. So Irene comes in. So Irene's been hired and says, hey, look, here's your credential. That's all you got. There's a CICD server. We need access to the environment. The CICD server is not telling me enough information for me to be able to figure out where in the world is Moriarty. I'm sorry, Sherlock Holmes. So Irene is focusing on escalating and then maybe hiding whenever they're escalated. So escalation is this idea that I have a certain level of credentials. I want to be able to take that and turn it around into a higher level credential. I can do more. I can see data. That's really what Moriarty is after, is data. He wants clues for where Sherlock might be. So, Irene started looking around and realized that a CICD server is intended to create things. Okay, so CICD server creates patches to an application, or in this particular case, can also create environments, can create storage accounts and virtual machines and those kind of things. So it's a not so much an application CICD, but also a cloud resource CICD pipeline. So maybe Irene will be, since Irene has access to the CICD server, maybe she can make changes that would give her access. This is, and she was able to go in and change the code that the CICD server executes to create an entire new service. It was able to create a new virtual machine and was able to put that virtual machine in a completely separate region than what's being used. So they're in US East 1, they're on the East Coast, and she put it over on the West Coast, hoping to hide. And this virtual machine had a backdoor, and the backdoor was SSH, let's say. And the virtual machine was given full admin privileges to the environment. She took those credentials, gave it back to Moriarty, so the Moriarty could continue operating. We're being a little vague on exactly how she does it to make it kind of an agnostic story on terms of which cloud, but there's multiple ways in which you can use a CICD pipeline, enter in that supply chain, basically is what we're doing, and escalate privileges, add things to it, or in this case, create a completely new virtual machine that's going to give her access, backdoor access to the environment. There's a company that used to be around in the 2014, they went under, called Code Spaces. And this is exactly what happened. The attacker gained access to the environment, didn't escalate privileges here, but did hide by creating a new virtual machine and hiding it in another part, probably another region in the environment. So the risk here is that automation for creating things requires the ability to create things. And so if I have a CICD server, that CICD server is your high risk attack surface. It's like an administrator is really what that is. So think of it as an administrative person. It's a person that can go and interact with the environment, can create and can delete even maybe depending on what the CICD service is. That CICD service is a high risk. We want to be able to monitor it. We want to know exactly when things get deployed to that CICD service and who's doing it and be able to track it back. How would I detect this? Activity logs are going to show changes to the environment. We want to look for changes in high risk roles. If I have administrative roles, I have CICD services, I have API roles maybe that are out there. I may want to monitor those and determine if they are changed. Another thing for the hiding, a lot of times in our cloud environment, we will put our monitoring services and focus them only in the regions where I have activity. So I only work in the East Coast. The West Coast is there. Like you can go in that West Coast environment if you really want to, but we've decided in our company, everything's going to be on East Coast, let's say. And so I don't monitor the West Coast. And so if something pops up in that West Coast, I may not be able to see it. In AWS language, you can look at something called guard duty. Guard duty is monitoring activities in the cloud, and you specify which regions. So I can limit the regions to maybe save some money, but then if someone spins up in that region, I'm not going to see it. So I need to be able to scan and monitor using my security tools in all regions that I have that I can possibly use. In AWS, I have the ability to disable, or I guess not enable, certain regions, but most of the regions are on by default. And unless you're doing some kind of lockdown, it's possible for your engineers to go and spin up in that environment. So how would I mitigate this kind of thing? Build security boundaries in your environment. Your CICD pipeline maybe could be in a completely different account than your other environments. And you can monitor the deployment from the CICD pipeline. You can say, I only allow deployments from the CICD pipeline and put a lot of monitoring on it. Maybe notice that, maybe Mycroft would notice that, hey, there was a new deployment and I hadn't seen that. I didn't do that myself. Somebody else did. Also limit access to your CICD pipeline. Don't allow changes to it. If I'm using Terraform, let's say, Terraform needs the ability to, when it creates a storage account or an S3 bucket, it needs to be able to create any name for that storage account. Because in order for a storage account to be deployed, it has to have a unique name. And so what Terraform usually do is you do some kind of random number generator and tack that to the end of a human readable word. So it would be like, I don't know, like library dash and then a bunch of letters and numbers to make it unique. And so the CICD pipeline really can't be locked down to say, I only want you to create S3 buckets that have this name, or I only want you to create virtual machines that have this kind of name, because the purpose of the CICD pipeline is to constantly be able to deploy new things. And if I have to tweak what the CICD pipeline is allowed to do, it can make it harder. And so that CICD pipeline is a major risk. Lock it down, monitor it, ensure that you can only deploy to it if maybe 2 people approve. I do work at GitHub, so I have some experience with using GitHub to do CI/CD. And in GitHub and through AWS and Azure, you're able to establish a trust relationship through OIDC that says, let's say I am only allowed to use a particular role in my cloud environment if it comes from this particular GitHub repo. And I can even say this particular GitHub repo with this particular branch. And so the only person who could use the CI/CD is if they deploy to GitHub. Now, that doesn't eliminate the problem. GitHub is, I'm just pushing the need to lock down credentials back to GitHub, but GitHub, I can enforce other things like saying you can't check in unless another person approves. There's a whole kinds of things you can lock that down. So there are ways to mitigate. And what you want to do is you want to try and put your risks in a place where you can monitor, and that the way that the high risk system operates is very predictable, and you can detect if something's out of the ordinary. If it's a virtual machine just sitting out there, just picking up files from an S3 bucket and deploying them, it's going to be really hard to determine if that's the way it's supposed to be or not. Okay, so what we have here is we have Irene has taken this this small limited access and was able to create an admin account or a virtual machine that has admin access in a completely different region with a secondary backdoor. So now it's outside of the monitoring that we were talking about with single sign-on service. And so we're going to now give that back to Moriarty. Moriarty is going to give that to another attacker to try and figure out where is the good dirt in the environment. And that's where Violet comes in. So Violet works for the British government. Violet works in the archive department, and Violet knows what good classified and sensitive information looks like. And so Violet will steal secrets and sell it to the highest bidder. And so Moriarty has brought her in. So Violet starts investigating the storage accounts and or S3 buckets. It could be either one, and investigating where all this data, and finds that there are some files that have the word classified in it. Ooh, it's interesting to Violet. Maybe not interesting to Moriarty. Moriarty's one focus is to figure out where is Sherlock Holmes. And this may not give us the information that she needs in order to find it, but she goes and steals that and keeps it for herself. She might be able to sell that to the highest bidder. She does find some files that have Mind Palace tagged on it. Mind Palace is a term that Sherlock Holmes has used before, and so figures that might be of something of interest to Moriarty and takes those files. Now, the problem, she tries to read them herself. Maybe she can make use of them, but they're encrypted. And so wasn't able to do it. So she grabs those files. She gets them off of her environment. What she does is they're in a storage account. She has a virtual machine that she has access to. Remember, it's the backdoor one that Irene had found or had created. And so Violet is going to go and grab those accounts, those files, and store them on the virtual machine. Now she's got to pull them out, but she wants to do it kind of a secret way. She doesn't want anybody to know that she's pulling it to her home account. So she then takes the files and stages them in the web page. the web page that's the bibliophile web page that describes the antique books that Mycroft is really interested in. And so she stores all her files there as a staging location. And once all the sensitive files are there, she can kind of leave, go out to her home, and then come in and grab the files through the internet, just like everybody else, making it a little bit harder to tell that those secrets are leaving the environment. Takes those files, hands them off to Moriarty. All right. So attackers, usually once they're gaining access to the environment, they really have two main goals. One of them is collection. They want to steal files from you. Or maybe they've just kind of stumbled in and they're going to steal files from you. The other thing they might do is an impact, which we don't talk about in this story, but the impact would be, or at this point, we haven't talked about it, but an impact might be destroying something. So ransomware. But in this case, the attacker is looking at espionage or looking at stealing secrets. So they're going to try and collect the data, and they want to be quiet about it. That's not always the case. Some attackers, when they gain access to the environment, they're going to go and try and grab those files as fast as they can and get them to their home environment. And if they get caught, then they get caught. That's the way it's going to be. There's one story that our co-author Alex talked about where an attacker had gained access to the environment and was pulling it to a staging environment, and they were zipping all the files up really fast. Well, it was pegging the CPU. And so people started noticing that, hey, this virtual machine is acting funny. It's not really responding like it's supposed to. And lo and behold, it was a staging system is what it was. The attacker had turned it to a staging system, which is what we're doing here. Although we're going to be Moriarty's team is going to be a lot more quiet. So you have the opportunity. How would I detect this thing? You have the opportunity to turn on logging on your storage services. Not everybody does. It's a lot of data. I always tell people that if you ever get hacked that you know of and you lost data, you'll immediately turn on logging on all your storage services, right? I mean, that's you're going to start doing it then. But premeditated, you may not. You may decide only do it for sensitive data. But you want to try and think, do I really need this data? And do I care if someone steals this? Do I care if somebody do I care to know if someone stole it? That's the right way to say it. You ever see that there's some kind of attack that's happened and they say, hey, we have no indication that someone has stolen data? That's code for I didn't turn the logs on, is what that is. How would I mitigate this? Encrypt your sensitive data with a special key that is not accessible to the CICD pipeline. Security teams, administrators, CICD pipelines, they don't really need to see sensitive data. Maybe in an emergency, there's a need, but for the most part, the system owner, like the product team, let's say we're a large company, not just an old book website, but if we're a large company, a product team might be given responsibility to see the insides of customer data or something like that. But me and the security team, I don't need to see it. And so encrypting your data with a customer created key and then not giving that key to accessible to most people is the best way to mitigate from this. Sensitive data should be in a separate security boundary. I would not put sensitive data in the same account or the same subscription as I would a website that's on the internet, right? So I want to separate those risk levels. When I teach class, I always talk about marketing as one risk level and like customer data is another one. So our marketing team, the goal is to put data on the internet, let's say. And so the data is at less risky than maybe internal customer data. And so I separate those either by AWS accounts or subscriptions to split those out. All right. So we've got the files. Some of the files have been encrypted, not with the cloud-based encryption that I'm talking about here, but there's some other kind of encryption on these files. And those have been handed to the evil Professor Moriarty. And so Professor Moriarty is going to take those and it's going to start evaluating them and finds that they're encrypted with a particular encryption. And he's got a bunch of keys that he's going to try. And he's going to set up a program that's going to try and decrypt these files offline. He's got massive computers. He can generate and execute and run through these pretty quickly. Runs through and overnight finds that one of the messages has been cracked. And so he's so excited. He pulls it up and he gets this message. And it says, Moriarty, it's always amusing to see you chase after me like a wild goose. But I'm afraid your latest pursuit is nothing more than a red herring, a diversion that's led you astray. Better luck next time, old boy. Furious, Moriarty goes back into the cloud environment through the backdoor access and deletes all of the virtual machines, all of the S3 buckets, everything, basically destroys the entire environment, knowing he's been had. He does not have the clue he was hoping to get to find the whereabouts of Sherlock Holmes. So beyond the decrypting a file, which is not really cloud-based, but we have an impact. So I said that there's usually a couple of things that an attacker is going to do when they gain access. Ransomware is a big one. Usually encrypting your systems and then saying, give me money and I'll decrypt them for you. That's a really big one. A smash operation like this doesn't always happen, but it does happen where they can go and delete things. And if you've got an admin access to your cloud environment, they can very quickly destroy everything. You might find yourself in a case where someone has gained access similar to this and accidentally checked in credentials that were admin credentials. And if you don't stop it, someone could just for fun go and delete everything in your environment. It's not far away for that to happen. And so there's some things that you can do to stop this. Well, to detect this, I guess I should say. Activity logs, CloudTrail or Azure activity logs will alert you when services are changing. Monitor heavily core services that should never be deleted. I've got, in a cloud environment, I've got virtual machines spinning up and down all the time. That's just their normal operation for apps. I may not notice it, but a file server that's running like my log server or my storage account with all my customer data, that shouldn't be deleted. And so I might want to monitor heavily deletions in certain locations. How do I know which locations? Maybe I put my sensitive services in a separate account and then just monitor everything right there, separate from like apps that will be changing constantly, doing that kind of thing. How would I mitigate it? Backup in a completely separate security boundary, usually a separate account, not in a separate region. That's doesn't make any sense for this particular case. Backing up in a separate region is really great in case there's a loss of, a region, let's say, or someone at the cloud environment makes a mistake, like in, was it, I don't know, it was like 2018 or something like that when S3 buckets on the East Coast went down. But in a completely separate boundary, in a different account that almost nobody has access to. Make sure you have special roles that are used for destruction. In AWS on an S3 bucket, you can say you're not allowed to delete this particular S3 bucket unless I log in with root as a human and enter my two-factor authentication. Like very specific. Oh, you can only do it a certain way for certain, like I can turn that on. Know what's elastic in your environment and know what is permanent. So we told this story. How do we know that this actually happened? Well, it turns out that this entire infrastructure was basically a deception network. We've heard of honey pots and honey tokens and honey files. Well, these are all those together. And so this network was set up specifically so that we could monitor, so that Watson and Sherlock and Mycroft can monitor how Moriarty operates and how they might execute an attack in another environment. And of course, the little joke that that Sherlock had to place in that file for Moriarty to find. Detection systems inside of your or externally facing, like honeypots, are really great to show what people are doing on drive-bys, right? It's really interesting to gather all of these username and passwords that somebody might be attacking the world with, and kind of there's a lot of people that do research on that. But putting these inside of your own production environment can really help try and hone in on attackers that have gained access and they're looking around stealthily. You haven't detected them yet. And these systems don't really operate normally. They're not real websites. They're not real storage services. And so I can put a tremendous amount of monitoring on them because the only people that should get them are attackers or maybe the rogue developer that doesn't know where they're at. They're new and they're looking around, right? That could also happen. And so this particular case, Sherlock had turned on full logging on all of these systems, were monitoring it heavily, and had a complete step-by-step report of what was happening inside the infrastructure. That's it with our story. Our poster basically defines the story, goes into more detail. And then on the back side, which is right here on the detection side, we have a lot more detail on what are the logs that are needed in order to detect attacks. And it's more general. It's not specific to the story. We have a bunch of the logs that we pulled together. This is really indicative of our class, Security 541, the Cloud Security Attacker Techniques, Monitoring and Threat Detection. It's a long name. It's really the cloud threat detection is what it is. And we have some classes coming up. You can catch me at Sandsfire in July. Ryan is going to be teaching at Cyber Central, Security Central, which I think is online in May. And then Alex is going to be in Singapore, May 22nd. And of course, you can always catch us anytime on demand. Unfortunately, you get me for the on demand. We also have our cloud aces. If you're a cloud security analyst or in cloud detection and threat response, on the left-hand side of your screen, those are the classes, including 541, that really fit well with those classes, with those kinds of job roles. And that's it for me. I am now can answer any questions you might have, about the story, about the posters, but anything about cloud, I'm here if there's any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sean. We do have a question. This one came in during the attacker slide. What about AITM used as an infrastructure, where their goal is to capture access tokens for 2FA users? How would we mitigate that? Using biometrics?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There's always, you're always going to have some kind of vulnerability, right? I mean, and so being able to say, hey, someone has, I've got, two-factor authentication, and they might be doing like push alerts. And so someone has done the whole, I've attacked the environment. I'm going to send push alerts over and over and over again until the engineer wakes up in the morning and just hits okay on accident. That has become a problem. And so now companies that implement these toolings like Microsoft, the Microsoft Authenticator requires you to enter one of these three numbers when those things come up. We can start adding to biometrics, which actually can be tough. I think the problem with biometrics is that it might work really well when I worked in an office building, and there was a guard, and you scan your badge, you enter a number, and then they look at you like there's a biometric scan there, human maybe, but it's harder in if you're going to have people working all over the world. Maybe they've never even met each other. You're shipping out computers and things like that. I think the best case for two-factor authentication is always hardware tokens, and make it super easy and cheap for your employees to grab a new token if they lose one and have a backup. In the particular case of this story, we were talking about a long-term credential that was being used by a third-party application, identity access management user, let's say, and that accidentally got pulled up into a GitHub repo. We have seen that happen, and an attacker automatically grabbing those credentials and starting to spin up Bitcoin miners within minutes. And so that kind of thing doesn't have, you don't do two-factor authentication with that type of execution. And so that's a big vulnerability point. And so a lot of people in their environments, they have long-term credentials that they do not rotate, that are being stored on files on disk, and then can accidentally be captured and sent up. So you got to find a different way to do that rather than long-term credentials. Yeah, good question.
Terrific. That's the only question we have. So I think we are done for today. I just dropped a link to the poster into the chat. So download it for free, and hopefully we will get to see you in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, thanks. Bye.